Hello, welcome to the episode. Today we are chatting about some super cool research that was just published outlining the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. And this has been studied before. However, this specific paper is unique because it takes bioavailability into account. And bioavailability is just a fancy way of saying absorbed. And this matters because there are lots of foods that have tons of nutrients in them, but due to various factors, a lot of those nutrients aren't all that accessible to us as humans. For example, spinach has a fair bit of calcium in it, but spinach also contains something called phytic acid, which inhibits the absorption of calcium in the gut. And so in order to get the equivalent amount of bioavailable calcium that a single glass of milk has, you'd have to eat something like 8 cups of spinach. Not all that practical, right? Because 8 cups of spinach is probably going to mess with your digestion. Now, I'm not saying that you should never eat spinach again. It's just not a great source of calcium specifically. And so the way that I like to think about bioavailability is via your total income versus your take-home income. So the total amount of calcium in spinach would represent your total income, and the amount that you actually absorb would be your take-home income after taxes. The total amount matters, of course, but practically speaking, the take-home is what we're really interested in. And when it comes to calcium specifically, spinach has a very high tax rate, whereas dairy has a much lower tax rate on it. So this list that we're going to go through in this episode is great because it takes this bioavailability concept into account. How cool is that, right? Because again, we're interested in take-home income. Like, how much of these nutrients are we actually absorbing and utilizing? So what we're going to do is go through the top 10 foods, and then I'm going to outline how I'd recommend actually implementing them into your diet. Because the idea isn't that you have to solely eat these 10 foods. That's not the case. So we'll dig into how to practically use this information in your life as well. Let's dig in. The way that the researchers scored different foods was like golf, okay? So the lower the score, the higher the nutrient density, and the number one food on the planet in regards to nutrient density and bioavailability was, any guesses? Liver. It clocked in at a 14. Pretty interesting, right? Liver is loaded with fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K. It's got B12, it's got folic acid, copper, iron. It is a nutrient powerhouse. Some folks refer to liver as nature's multivitamin. A quick little liver busting myth here. A lot of folks believe that the liver is where toxins are stored, and that's not actually true. The liver acts as a neutralizer or a converter, essentially. So it doesn't store drugs, toxins, poisons, etc. It simply reshapes or molds them into forms that our bodies can more readily deal with and excrete. Meaning, you don't need to worry about eating, say, beef liver because there are a whole bunch of toxins in it. Fortunately, that is not the case. Having said that, just because some of something is good doesn't necessarily mean that more is better. So don't stop this podcast to go scarf down a bunch of liver. You don't want to do that. And I'll tell you why in the practical implementation part of this episode. Number 2 on the list is another interesting body part. It's spleen. Not all that appetizing to a lot of folks, but the data is what the data is. And spleen was rated at a 62. So liver was a 14 and spleen is a 62. Number 3 is small dried fish. So things like anchovies or sardines would fall under this category. And they were right on the coattails of spleen at a 65. Super nutrient dense. Behind small dried fish, we've got some veggies in the mix. Dark leafy greens clocked in at a 71 in the fourth spot. So stuff like bok choy, arugula, lettuces, broccoli, kale, all those guys. Number 5 were something called bivalves, and bivalves is just another word for seafood, like oysters, clams, mussels, and scallops. Super nutrient dense foods, and they were a 90 on the nutrient density scale. Number 6 was kidney. Number 7 was heart. So as you can see, we've got a lot of organ meats in the top 10 here. They are without a doubt the most nutrient dense foods in the world. But unfortunately, they're somewhat out of vogue, at least in North America. Not super common to see organ meats on folks' plates nowadays. I'm in Playa del Carmen, Mexico right now, and I found this taco spot that does all sorts of different cuts. So I've had spleen tacos, brain tacos, eyeball tacos, not my favorite texture, tongue tacos. Tongue is one of my favorites. I know it sounds odd, but the taste and texture is amazing when it's cooked. And keep in mind, these foods may sound strange, but only because of culture. For example, if you grew up eating these foods, it's just food. And don't think for a second that our ancestors didn't eat nose to tail, meaning the whole animal. Eating only chicken breast as a meat source is an incredibly new concept, evolutionarily speaking. Number 8 is crustaceans. And you might be thinking, what's with this funky language and what is a crustacean? Because this is a scientific paper, they use the quote-unquote proper verbiage, and crustaceans refer to things like shrimp, lobster, and crab, and these were a 193 on the nutrient scale. Number 9 was goat. Goat is delicious, by the way. I had a goat curry not too long ago, and yum. Number 10 was beef. And just for good measure, we'll cover number 11 and 12 as a bonus. In the 11th spot, we have eggs. Eggs were a 279, a great score. And number 12 were vitamin A rich fruit and veggies. So things like mango, cantaloupe, grapefruit, carrots, squash, stuff like that. Now you might be thinking, where are all the media labeled superfoods? Shouldn't they be at the top of the list? The answer is no, because when you factor in bioavailability, absorption in the human gut, a lot of the quote-unquote superfoods just don't register all that high. The reason being is, animals defend themselves via running away, fighting back, biting, clawing, etc. And so once an animal's defenses are down, they're down. And so they're incredibly well digested and absorbed foods as a whole. Plants, on the other hand, cannot run away. They can't bite you or claw you, and so they use chemical defense mechanisms in order to survive because they are rooted in the ground, right? And so it only makes sense because if plants couldn't defend themselves, they would have gone extinct millions of years ago. But they've actually been around for far longer than we have. These chemical defenses that plants have often inhibit nutrient absorption to one degree or another. And fortunately, we can sidestep some of these defenses via things like cooking, sprouting, fermenting, etc. For example, some folks find that certain raw veggies just don't agree with their stomachs, but if they cook them, they sit much better. There is a lot of intelligence and arguably even sentience in plants. They know what they're doing. They are very much alive and responding to their external environment, even though they don't howl or moo. Now, I'm definitely not saying that because plants have these chemical defense mechanisms, that we should all avoid them completely. I eat plants, but again, we'll cover more specifics in the practical takeaway part of this episode. Just for fun, let's touch on a few other super popular foods that we consume nowadays. Where do they stack up nutrient density wise? Quinoa was a 789 on this scale. So liver was a 14, quinoa is a 789. Not quite as nutrient dense as we'd once thought when we take bioavailability into account. Seeds, so things like hemp seeds, chia seeds, sunflower seeds, they were an 880. Okay, chicken was a 1075. We eat a ton of chicken nowadays, and it's not nearly as nutrient dense as a bunch of other protein sources, which we covered. Interesting, right? And again, I feel the need to mention this. This doesn't mean that you should just stop eating chicken immediately. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater here. Where did whole grains land? They were a 1640. Isn't this fascinating? Like, how often have you heard you need to eat your whole grains? And whole grains is literally listed on the front of a ton of food packaging as if it's a superfood, right? Made with 100% whole grains. Nuts. We love our nuts. They were in 1829. Pretty wild, right? Now, where did refined grains clock in? Refined grains would be essentially straight up processed foods, which are things like cereal, donuts, pastries, muffins. They are at the bottom of the barrel in the last spot. Shocker. And they're listed as a 4,000 plus, meaning that's as high as the scale goes. Refined grains are not very nutrient dense. Now, again, for reference, liver was a 14, leafy greens were a 71, eggs were a 279, and refined grains are over 4,000. Now, I doubt that this is surprising to you, but it's kind of wild to see it actually quantified and compared to the most nutrient-dense foods, right? It really puts things into perspective. We know that hyperpalatable processed foods aren't all that healthful, but when there are actual numbers put to it, it's crazy just how much variance there is between all of these single ingredient healthful whole foods that you hear me promoting all the time versus all of the processed junk that we have such easy access to and we're consuming in larger amounts than ever before. No wonder so many folks are struggling with their health, right? It's also fascinating to see things like nuts, seeds, quinoa, and whole grains so far down the list. And not that these foods are categorically bad, they're not. But the actual nutrition that we're yielding from them is far less than we'd hope. Interesting little aside, I was on a flight from London to Mexico a few weeks back, and I had the option of modifying my meal for the quote-unquote healthy version, which I did, and out came a vegan sandwich with some nut and seed spreads, crackers, and a vegan fruitcake for dessert. Then I looked to my left, and the guy sitting next to me had a nice piece of beef with potatoes and those same nut and seed spreads, and then a little mini cheesecake or something like that for dessert. Now, to say that I was disappointed is an understatement. The regular meal was way more nutrient dense and healthier than the supposed healthy meal. What the fuck? I ended up asking for a regular meal instead. I wanted that beef and potatoes, but unfortunately they were all out. And so I just didn't eat because I knew that that sandwich, spreads, and fruitcake would not have sat well in my stomach. But building off of this supposedly healthy vegan airplane meal, you probably noticed that the top 10 has a lot of animal foods in it. 9 out of the top 10 most nutrient-dense foods or food groups are animals, in fact. And yet, in the Western world right now, vegan diets are being touted as the epitome of health. And if someone chooses to skip animal products for whatever reason, hey, that's totally cool. To each their own. More power to you. But the problem that I have with this is that it's wrong. A vegan diet is not the most healthful diet because humans are not vegans. Humans are omnivores. And so the idea that eliminating all of these super nutrient dense animal foods in the name of health is exactly what you don't want to do. 9 out of the 10 most nutrient dense foods or food groups on the planet are off limits in a vegan diet. And so how could it be the most healthful way to eat, right? It makes no sense. In my opinion, everyone should be able to choose what they put in their bodies. I believe that very strongly. But misleading the public in terms of what the most healthful way of eating actually is, that's not cool. Now, if you're feeling a little conflicted here because of all of the media claims in regards to animal husbandry, ethics, the climate, and health, or you're just interested in actually educating yourself on the big picture when it comes to this stuff, I'd highly recommend a book called Sacred Cow by Diana Rogers. It is amazing. She is doing incredible work. And there's also a video documentary version, and she tackles the ethics, the health, and the climate considerations all in one place and how they intersect. That is the most important thing, because we can't silo and separate these concepts because they all exist together. It's called the circle of life for a reason. It's not the compartments of life. This stuff is all linked. Interesting, actually. Beyond Meat, which you may have heard of, is a plant-based, quote-unquote, meat alternative. And I say that because it's straight up processed food. They are in some trouble because they got caught lying about the protein content in their products. Apparently, they were off by as much as 40%. That's a lot. They're also in some hot water over some of their sustainability claims, because it turns out that you can't just say something is environmentally sustainable without having actual evidence to back it up. And when they were asked to show that evidence, they weren't able to do that. And that's because it's not sustainable. It turns out that Mother Nature kind of has this sustainability thing figured out. Now, Beyond Meat has a 75% projected likelihood of bankruptcy at the moment, simply because people aren't buying their products, even with Kim Kardashian endorsing them. So in the end, the market is figuring this stuff out. Now, practical takeaways. How do you actually implement this stuff? First of all, I'd recommend including more of these nutrient-dense foods into your day-to-day eating pattern. But like I alluded to before, just because some of something is good doesn't mean that more is necessarily better. And you can think about this like sun exposure. Sun exposure is super healthy. Too little is no bueno, and too much is also no good. So if we take liver, for example, it is so nutrient dense that you actually don't want to consume too much of it. That will create issues. And so 3 to 6 ounces, for example, per week is plenty. When I first implemented liver into my diet, I was eating it raw and just sort of swallowing it. But recently I started tossing an ounce or 2 into my ground beef, and you can barely notice it. And so this is a great way to get some liver into your diet without offending your taste buds if you're just not a big fan. Liver and onions is a fairly popular way to get some liver in your life as well, but whatever works for you. Also, if the organ meats are too much of a stretch for you mentally, or you just don't want to eat them, you can always just implement more of the other top 10 foods that you enjoy. You don't have to eat organ meats by any means. Now, as a whole, when it comes to healthful eating and supplying your body with the nutrients that it needs, the number one consideration is digestion, okay? So let's take leafy greens, for example. They're super nutrient dense, but similarly to liver, just because some is good doesn't mean that more is better. And so pay close attention to your digestion first and foremost. Meaning, if you eat broccoli and it upsets your stomach and makes you gassy, you might not want to eat it. On the other hand, if lettuces and things like arugula sit really well in your stomach, favor these guys. Taking this to the extreme, some folks are allergic to shellfish, and shellfish are really high on this nutrient density scale. But if you're allergic to something, no matter how nutrient dense it is, obviously don't eat it. So ultimately, I'd recommend mixing in more of these nutrient-dense foods that you may not already be eating, with the caveat that your digestion is priority number one. Now, if you're interested in checking out this paper for yourself, I linked it below, as well as Diana's book and documentary, Sacred Cow. I'd highly recommend digging into it. Also, if you have any questions about this stuff, I love questions, feel free to reach out to me. If you're interested in applying for one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can click the link in the description below or head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching. On Instagram, I'm at N1Fitness. On TikTok, I'm at the N1Fitness. And on YouTube, I am at Marcus Sadhu. Feel free to leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform if you'd like, and be sure to hit the subscribe button. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope that you found this episode useful, and I will catch you on the next one. See ya.